I wrapped up my business trip in Colorado 2 days earlier than planned, fully expecting to unwind in the quiet comfort of my own home. But when I arrived at my estate in Chicago, the entire house was pitch black and dead silent, except for a heavy, violent thumping coming from the basement. I crept down the stairs in the dark and found my son alone in the middle of the night, furiously scrubbing a dress shirt over a utility sink. When I asked him what he was doing, he practically jumped out of his skin, dropped the shirt into the sink, and collapsed onto the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. I looked into the sink, and the water pooling in the drain was thick and deep red. Before he could even assemble a coherent sentence, I turned around and sprinted upstairs to find my wife. What I saw inside our primary bedroom made my blood run completely cold. My name is Harrison Wright. I am 70 years old, and I am the founder and sole owner of a massive logistics empire. Over the past 40 years, I built my company from a single battered delivery truck into a multi-billion-dollar operation, moving freight across every major highway and railway in North America. I know every warehouse, every supply chain detail, and every ruthless business strategy in this country. I built this life of incredible wealth and privilege so my family would never have to experience the bitter, grinding poverty I grew up in. But tonight, that ice-cold chill was inside my own home. I had just wrapped up a helicopter survey of a new distribution hub in the Colorado mountains. Earlier that afternoon, the weather turned dangerously unpredictable. I made an executive call to shorten the trip and fly back to Chicago on my private jet. I didn't bother calling ahead to tell anyone I was coming home early. I was exhausted, and all I wanted was to crawl into bed next to my wife, Cynthia. We had been married for 40 years. I gave her everything she ever wanted. I made sure she never had to work a single day in her life. I paid for our son, Bradley, to attend a top Ivy League business school, securing his MBA so he could eventually take my place. I spent decades patiently grooming him to be my chief financial officer. I entrusted my entire life and legacy to them. When my driver pulled up to the gates of our estate, the heavy iron doors slid open without a sound. The sprawling mansion was completely dark. Not a single light burned in any of the windows, which was extremely unusual. Whenever I was out of town, Cynthia always left the warm porch lights on for me. I thanked my driver, grabbed my small leather duffel, and used my key to unlock the heavy mahogany front door. Inside the grand foyer, the silence was suffocating. It felt heavy and unnatural, as if the house itself were holding its breath. I slipped off my winter coat, hung it in the closet, and paused to listen. That was when I heard it. A rhythmic, violent pounding, echoing up from the lower level. The basement. I set my duffel bag down by the entrance and picked my way softly toward the basement stairs. The polished hardwood felt freezing beneath my dress shoes. With every step down into the dark, the pounding grew louder and more erratic. It was our heavy-duty washing machine. But it wasn't running a normal cycle. It was tumbling wildly, as though something extremely heavy and completely unbalanced had been thrown into the drum. I rounded the corner, and the harsh, fluorescent lights of the laundry room temporarily blinded me. There, hunched over the deep stainless steel sink, was Bradley, my 35-year-old son, the man I trusted to inherit my kingdom. He was frantically, aggressively rubbing a torn dress shirt under running water. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, just watching him. His movements were chaotic, driven by sheer panic. This was a man who wore custom Italian suits every single day. a man who hired professional staff to detail his luxury cars and dry clean every stitch of clothing in his wardrobe. In his entire adult life, he had never washed a single load of laundry himself. Yet here he was at midnight, desperately scrubbing wet fabric as if his life depended on it. I stepped into the bright light and asked a simple question. "What are you doing?" Bradley jolted violently, as if a gun had gone off right beside his ear. He spun around, dropping the soaked shirt back into the sink. The color drained from his face until he looked like a corpse. His eyes were wide with a deep, primal terror I had never seen in another human being. He stared at me as if he were looking at a ghost. He opened his mouth to speak, but not a single word came out. His chest heaved wildly, and then his knees gave out. He collapsed onto the cold tile floor, hyperventilating and gasping for air. I took a step closer, my fatherly instincts waging a fierce war against the sharp alarm bells going off in my head. I stepped right past my trembling son and looked down into the deep sink. The water swirling around the drain wasn't soapy or dirty. It was thick, heavy, deep red. The unmistakable metallic scent hit me instantly. It was blood. My heart stopped. My son was on the floor, weeping uncontrollably and struggling to breathe. And in front of me was a sink filled with ruined, blood-soaked clothing. My first thought wasn't betrayal or deception. It was that a sudden tragedy had struck. I assumed an intruder had broken into the house. I thought someone had been gravely hurt or worse. My mind immediately flashed to the person I loved most in this world. Cynthia. I didn't wait for Bradley to catch his breath. I didn't ask another question, and I didn't reach down to help him. I turned around and sprinted up the basement stairs with a speed and agility I didn't know my 70-year-old legs still possessed. I ran past the dark gourmet kitchen, down the main hallway, and flew up the grand curved staircase leading to the second floor. The house was still deadly quiet, but the frantic pounding of my own heart was deafening in my ears. I reached the tall double doors of our primary suite. They were resting slightly ajar, letting a sliver of warm light spill out into the dark hallway. I threw the doors open, ready to confront whatever intruder had broken into my home to harm my family. Instead, I froze, utterly paralyzed by the scene unfolding before me. There was no chaotic crime scene in that room. It was a scene of relaxed celebration. Cynthia, my wife of 40 years, and Stephanie, my 33-year-old daughter-in-law, were sitting comfortably on our massive California king bed. They were dressed in matching silk robes, holding crystal flutes filled with Dom Perignon champagne. They looked completely relaxed, completely happy, and utterly untouched by any tragedy. But it wasn't their luxury that made my blood freeze solid. Spread neatly across the white down duvet was a collection of documents and items that shattered my reality in an instant. Right in the center, illuminated under the bedside lamp, was a document stamped with an official government seal. I could read the bold black letters clearly from where I stood. It was a death certificate, my official death certificate. Next to it was a fully completed and signed $20 million corporate life insurance claim. And at the foot of the bed sat a heavy, black canvas duffel bag, unzipped to reveal thick stacks of banded $100 bills. I slumped against the doorframe, completely unable to process the sheer madness of what I was looking at. Cynthia turned her head casually and saw me standing there in my suit. The crystal champagne glass slipped right through her fingers, crashing onto the hardwood and shattering into 100 glittering pieces. Vintage champagne soaked into the imported Persian rug For one long second, her face twisted into absolute, unadulterated horror. My juicy. She wore the exact same expression Bradley had shown in the basement, as if she were staring directly at a ghost come back to drag her down. But Cynthia was a master of adaptation and survival. For decades, I had watched her charm cold politicians and negotiate with cutthroat board members. Without missing a single beat, the genuine horror on her face transformed into a mask of overwhelming, dramatic relief. She let out a piercing, theatrical sob, scrambled off the bed, and ran across the room. She threw her arms around my neck, buried her face in my chest, and began weeping uncontrollably. She clung to me as if she had just witnessed a genuine miracle. "Oh my God, Harrison," she wailed, her voice trembling with perfectly crafted fake emotion. "You're alive. You're really alive. The police called us hours ago. They told us you were gone, forever." She pulled back slightly, gripping my shoulders and staring deep into my eyes with heavy tears streaming down her face. "The Colorado State Patrol called me this afternoon. They said, your rented SUV went over a steep cliff in a dangerous mountain pass. They said it crashed into a deep rocky ravine and burned to ashes. They thought you were trapped inside. They told me my husband was dead." I stood completely motionless, feeling the warmth of her fake tears soaking through my dress shirt. I remembered the 40 years I had sacrificed to build this. The freezing mornings leaving before sunrise, the relentless travel, the endless stress. I had done it all for her, for my son, and for this family. And now, I was standing in my own home, looking at my own death certificate, watching them celebrate my end while my blood washed down the drain downstairs. Those endless late nights sifting through mountain after mountain of shipping manifests. The suffocating, lethal stress that nearly gave me a heart attack in my 50s. All of it was meant to guarantee her safety, stability, and comfort. And now, here she was, staring right into my eyes, holding me tight, pulling off a masterclass in calculated deception. Stephanie stepped casually away from the bed, setting her champagne glass down on the mahogany nightstand. She walked toward us, her face perfectly echoing Cynthia's fake relief and sorrow. "We were completely destroyed, Harrison," she chimed in, her voice soft, soothing, and utterly persuasive. "Right after the State Patrol contacted Cynthia, the bank called us. They warned us that because of the sheer size of your estate, all your primary assets and corporate were going to be frozen immediately for a massive probate process. We panicked. We were just desperately trying to protect your financial legacy and keep company operations running smoothly without the IRS stepping in. That cash on the bed, that was just an emergency withdrawal. We managed to pull right before the government locked us out. We were only trying to protect this family." I looked right past Cynthia's shoulder, staring at the documents on the bed. A certified death certificate doesn't just materialize hours after an accident in a remote mountain pass. A $20 million corporate life insurance payout isn't processed, approved, and authorized in the middle of the night. And a black bag packed with millions in cold, hard cash isn't handed over after hours by a friendly bank teller. Every single word out of their mouths was part of a carefully constructed lie designed to cover up a massive, calculated crime. "And what about Bradley?" I asked, keeping my voice raspy and hollow, perfectly playing the part of a fragile old man in deep emotional shock. I saw him in the basement. He looked terrified. He was frantically scrubbing a dress shirt that was completely covered in dark red blood. Cynthia didn't even flinch. She reached up, gently stroking my cheek and wiping away her fake tears with the back of her hand. "Oh, Harrison," she whispered, dripping with theatrical sympathy. "Our poor boy. When he got the news that you were gone, he completely broke down. He couldn't handle the grief. Yesterday afternoon, he took his outdoor gear and went out to the old limestone reserve to clear his head in the woods. He was so shaken up and distracted that, when he was dressing the deer he got, he made a mess and got blood all over his clothes. He just got home a little bit ago. He's completely traumatized, just like the rest of us." I wrapped my arms around my crying wife, holding her close and playing the role of a grieving, shattered man seeking comfort in her familiar embrace. I let my shoulders slump. I kept my breathing shallow and rapid. I gave an Oscar-worthy performance of an exhausted, traumatized survivor. I gave a slow, vacant nod, acting as if their absurd story made complete sense to my weary mind. I murmured that the shock was just too much to process, that I needed a private moment to wash my face, gather my thoughts, and process everything. I slowly unclasped Cynthia's tight grip and shuffled into the massive primary bathroom, shutting the heavy solid wood door behind me. I turned on the brass faucet, letting cold water run into the marble sink, and splashed it liberally over my face. The icy shocks snapped my focus into razor-sharp clarity. I looked up into the mirror. I didn't see a fragile, clueless 70-year-old man ready to be put out to pasture. I saw a hardened veteran who had survived brutal corporate wars, cutthroat rivals, and impossible economic crashes. I saw a man who was about to wage absolute war inside his own home. As I dried my dripping face with a plush towel, the secure phone in my inner jacket pocket buzzed. It was an encrypted, silent alert from my private offshore banking network. I pulled the device out and stared at the illuminated screen. The automated notification was clear, undeniable, and damning. The biometric override for my primary offshore emergency account had been successfully bypassed, moving an exact sum of $20 million. That high-level banking system required strict multi-factor authentication for an emergency override. It needed real-time biometric data, my data. Or it needed the biometric data of the only other person on Earth I had legally authorized as a proxy in the event of my actual death. I stared at the glowing screen as the cold, hard truth settled deep into my bones. Only 2 people on this planet had biometric access to those hidden funds. Myself and the man downstairs who had just been desperately trying to scrub the physical evidence of his ultimate betrayal out of a ruined dress shirt. My son, my own flesh and blood. They hadn't just prepared for my sudden death. They had actively engineered it. They had paid people to make it happen. And when the hit in Colorado failed, and I unexpectedly walked through the front door, they seamlessly put on a smile, threw their arms around me, and welcomed me home. I stood frozen in the bathroom, staring at the encrypted screen. That biometric notification was a death warrant, written in plain text. $20 million drained from my offshore fund, authorized by the retina scan of my own son. The young man I had raised on my shoulders, the man I had patiently groomed to inherit my entire empire. Every piece of the puzzle slammed into place with sickening clarity. The staged accident on the Colorado Mountain Pass, the pre-printed death certificate, the sudden cash withdrawal, the frantic midnight laundry session in the basement. They thought I was dead. When I walked through the door, they effortlessly slipped into the roles of grieving, relieved family members. My heart pounded furiously against my ribs. I pressed my hands flat against the cold marble sink, forcing myself to take a slow, deep breath. I couldn't let them know I had seen right through their game. If I confronted them right now, isolated inside my own house, I'd be putting myself in immediate physical danger. It was 3 against 1. I had to play the performance of a lifetime. I had to be the fragile, exhausted old man who had miraculously survived a terrible accident. I splashed cold water over my face again, soaking the collar of my shirt. I grabbed a towel, taking my time to dry off, systematically erasing every trace of the burning fury boiling in my veins. I took one last look in the mirror, stooped my posture slightly, and adjusted my expression to look utterly defeated. I unlocked the heavy door and shuffled back into the bedroom. Cynthia and Stephanie were still standing near the massive bed. The black duffel bag stuffed with cash was now zipped shut. Cynthia rushed back to my side, wrapping her arms around my waist and pressing her head, against chest in another display of fake devotion. "Oh, Harrison," she whispered sweetly, her voice trembling with manufactured concern. "You look completely spent, my love. You need to rest. We can handle all the legal and financial mess tomorrow." I rested a heavy hand on her shoulder and offered a weak, trembling smile. "You're right, Cynthia," I rasped, keeping my voice low and unsteady. "The shock of everything. It's just too much for my old heart. I just want to lay down in my own bed." Stephanie quickly picked up the canvas bag full of cash along with the fake documents. "I'll put these down in the safe, Harrison," she said, smoothly. "You just rest and be glad you're home safe with us." I gave a slow nod, watching her walk out of the room with the physical proof of their ultimate betrayal. Cynthia helped me out of my suit jacket, acting every bit like the loving, devoted wife she had pretended to be for 40 years. Every time her skin brushed against mine, a chill ran down my spine, but I let her tuck me beneath the thick, warm duvet of our bed. She turned off the bedside lamp, plunging the room into total darkness, and slid into bed beside me. She rested a hand gently on my chest, right over my beating heart. I lay there in the dark, staring blindly at the ceiling, forcing my breathing to stay slow and steady. Minutes dragged into agonizing hours. I listened to the rhythmic sound of her breathing, waiting for her to drift into a deep sleep. Lying there in the quiet dark, my mind drifted over the 40 years I had spent building this life. I remembered our early days, when we had nothing but ambition and a shared dream. I had worked myself to the bone, sacrificing my health and my youth to make sure she would never have to worry about a single bill. I bought her mansions, luxury cars, and diamonds. I sent our son to the most elite private schools and universities money could buy. I handed them total financial freedom, and in return they handed me a death sentence. The betrayal was so raw it felt like a physical blade twisting in my gut. But I wasn't going to let them win. I waited until the antique grandfather clock in the hall struck 3 in the morning. Cynthia's breathing was heavy and even. She was completely out, probably dreaming about the $20 million she thought she had successfully stolen. I carefully lifted her arm off my chest, slid out from under the covers, and moved silently across the room. Barefoot, I navigated the plush carpet, slipped down the grand staircase, and navigated the dark, quiet hallways of my estate. I went straight back to the basement laundry room. The harsh overhead fluorescents were off. I turned on a small task light in the corner and walked up to the stainless steel sink. It had been scrubbed completely clean, but Bradley had been panicked. He wasn't a professional criminal. I opened the large plastic trash bin next to the washing machine and began sifting through the discarded items. Right at the bottom, hidden under a pile of old rags, I found it. The torn, expensive dress shirt he had been frantically washing when I first arrived. It was still damp. I pulled it out and held it under the dim light. The dark stains covering the sleeves and collar weren't blood. It was a thick, iron-rich red clay, laced with the distinct, sharp chemical odor of industrial diesel fuel. My 70-year-old brain recognized that specific combination instantly. It was an exact match for the soil profile at an unregistered, restricted limestone quarry I had acquired 40 miles outside of Chicago decades ago. It was a completely abandoned site, surrounded by heavy chain-link fencing and automated security gates. Why was my grieving son digging in the mud at my abandoned quarry on the exact night I was supposed to have died? I pulled my secure tablet from a hidden desk drawer and logged directly into the quarry property's automated gate registry. The digital logs confirmed my worst, most terrifying suspicion. The heavy security gate had been bypassed using top-tier executive access codes at precisely 10 o'clock that very night. I pulled up the live security camera feed, overlooking the flooded pit. The screen flickered to life, showing a black SUV parked dangerously close to the edge of the dark water. Two very familiar figures were in the process of rolling a heavy, human-sized canvas tarp right into the deep, murky quarry. The heavy bundle hit the dark surface on my screen with a massive, silent splash. I watched the ripples spread across the flooded pit, frozen in absolute horror at what I was witnessing. Through the high-definition night vision camera, I watched the weighted package sink rapidly into the icy depths of the abandoned limestone pit. The two figures standing on the muddy edge didn't look away. They stood there, watching the air bubbles rise to the surface, making sure their dark secret was buried for good. I zoomed in on the camera feed, my hands shaking against the smooth glass of the tablet. As the image sharpened, the breath caught painfully in my throat. It was Bradley. My son was standing in the cold mud, hands on his knees, gasping for air. And right beside him, casually wiping her hands on a dark towel, was Stephanie. My sweet, elegant daughter-in-law was helping my son dispose of a body in the dead of night. I stared at the screens as they turned around and walked back toward the parked SUV. My mind spun completely out of control, trying to make sense of the madness. I had suspected them of financial betrayal. I had suspected them of plotting to have me declared legally dead to steal $20 million from my emergency offshore accounts. But this was something else entirely. This was cold-blooded, calculated murder. Who was wrapped in that heavy canvas? Was it the hitman they had hired to kill me in Colorado? Had the killer come to Chicago to demand his payment after failing his assignment? Bradley wasn't a cold-blooded criminal. He was a spoiled corporate executive who played golf on weekends and complained about the temperature of his imported coffee. Yet here he was, bypassing military-grade security systems to dump a corpse on my private, unregistered land. They were framing me. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest. If the authorities ever discovered that body on my restricted property, it would fall squarely on my shoulders. I watched the black SUV make a U-turn, its bright headlights cutting through the thick fog as it drove away from the quarry's edge. I quickly shut down the app and wiped the local access history from the device, leaving no digital footprint of my midnight investigation. I stood alone under the harsh artificial light of the laundry room, listening to the quiet hum of the appliances. I looked down at the torn dress shirt at the bottom of the trash bin. The red clay and sharp diesel smell weren't just clues from a late-night trip anymore. They were physical evidence of a homicide. I carefully folded the damp, ruined fabric, shoving it deep under the discarded rags and empty detergent bottles, putting it back exactly where Bradley had hidden it. I had to leave everything completely untouched. I couldn't let them suspect for a second that I had uncovered their dark secret. If they were capable of murdering someone and dumping the body in the middle of the night, they wouldn't hesitate to finish the job on me. They had started with me. After all, I was completely surrounded by predators. I turned off the small task light, plunging the basement back into complete darkness. I walked slowly up the wooden stairs, my bare feet making no sound on the polished floor. Now, every shadow in my sprawling estate felt like a hidden threat. The grand family portraits hanging on the hallway walls seemed to mock me in the dark. We looked like the picture-perfect American success story, but it was all a beautifully constructed lie. I reached the second floor and stood outside the heavy, double doors of the primary suite. I had to go back in. I had to lay down in the dark right beside the woman who had orchestrated this entire nightmare. I took a long, deep breath, forcing my racing heart to slow down, forcing my facial muscles to relax into the expression of an exhausted, broken old man. I turned the brass handle with extreme care and slipped back into the spacious bedroom. The room was still deathly quiet. Cynthia was lying in the exact spot where I had left her, her breathing slow and steady. I crept across the soft rug and slid carefully under the heavy, warm blankets. I lay flat on my back, staring up at the invisible ceiling. I didn't close my eyes for a single second, listening to the ticking of the grandfather clock downstairs as the time dragged painfully on. My mind raced through 1,000 different scenarios, trying to construct a plan that would keep me alive while exposing their monstrous crimes. I couldn't just call the police. Local authorities would never believe a confused, exhausted old man claiming his loving, wealthy family was secretly running a murder plot. Cynthia would manipulate the narrative with ease. Lordy. She would show them the pre-printed death certificate. She would claim the trauma of the mountain accident had shattered my fragile mental state. They would use my allegations as proof of my declining health and gain legal guardianship over my entire estate. I needed concrete, undeniable proof. I needed to trap them in the very web of lies they had spun. As the first faint light of dawn began to seep through the heavy silk drapes, I made a silent vow to myself. I was going to tear this fake family apart, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but the truth. Morning sunlight slowly illuminated the huge, luxurious bedroom, casting long shadows across the designer furniture. Cynthia shifted gracefully under the heavy duvet, letting out a soft sigh as she began to wake up. I immediately closed my eyes, letting my mouth hang open slightly to mimic the heavy, exhausted sleep of a traumatized survivor. I felt her shift her weight on the mattress, leaning over me until her warm breath was just inches from my face. I could smell the sweet lavender lotion she wore. I kept my breathing shallow, fighting down the overwhelming urge to push her away. She reached out, gently stroking my silver hair, playing the role of a devoted, relieved wife to perfection. It took every ounce of my strength not to flinch under her touch. "Good morning, my love," she whispered softly, her quiet voice dripping with the exact same artificial sweetness as the night before. I opened my eyes slowly, blinking against the morning light, pretending to be confused and disoriented. I gave her a weak, trembling smile. "Good morning, Cynthia," I rasped, my voice sounding rough and strained. I barely made it through the night. I watched her smile widen, masking the absolute monster lurking beneath her polished skin. The morning light cut through the silk drapes, throwing long, bright beams across the hardwood floor. I hadn't slept a wink since returning from the abandoned limestone quarry. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that heavy canvas package sinking into the dark, icy water while my son watched from the muddy bank. When I heard footsteps approaching the bedroom door, I forced my eyes shut and regulated my breathing, stepping right back into character. The heavy door creaked open, and I let out a groggy groan, pretending to wake up. It was Stephanie, my 33-year-old daughter-in-law. She walked in carrying a silver tray with a steaming mug of chamomile tea and a small crystal saucer holding my daily blood pressure medication. She was wearing a soft yellow sundress, wearing a warm, bright smile that looked entirely genuine. I sat up slowly, leaning heavily against the headboard, letting my hands tremble as I reached out toward her. "Good morning, Harrison," she whispered, setting the tray on my nightstand. "After such a terrible ordeal, you need to keep your strength up." I looked at her manicured hands and remembered the day she married my son. I had been so thrilled to welcome her into our family that I bought them a $1.5 million luxury condo downtown just as a wedding gift. I wanted her to feel completely secure and loved. Now she was looking at me with sweet eyes, hiding the monster underneath. I reached for the crystal saucer, but my instinct screamed a warning. After last night, I knew better than to trust anything they handed me. These people weren't my caregivers. They were my executioners, patiently waiting for me to close my eyes for the final time. I looked down at the small blue capsule resting on the polished glass. It looked identical to the expensive prescription medication I took every morning to regulate my heart rate. But the air in the room felt impossibly heavy, and a deep, primal alarm was blaring in my chest. I needed to secure that pill. Without raising suspicion, I took a sharp breath and immediately staged a violent, dramatic coughing fit. I hunched forward, clutching my chest, gasping frantically for air as if my lungs were collapsing. My arm swept across the nightstand in a chaotic blur, completely knocking over the delicate porcelain mug. Scalding chamomile tea spilled everywhere, soaking into the duvet and splashing onto the floor. "Oh my goodness, Harrison," Stephanie gasped, jumping back to avoid the hot liquid. She grabbed a thick towel from the bathroom and began frantically dabbing at the massive wet stain. "I'm so sorry, Stephanie," I wheezed, keeping up the dramatic, coughing performance while she was completely distracted. In that brief window of chaos, my fingers moved with lightning speed. I snatched the blue pill from the crystal saucer and slipped it deep into the side pocket of my pajama pants. "It's all right, Harrison," she soothed, completely oblivious to what I had just done. "I'll have housekeeping swap out these ruined linens immediately. You just lay back down and try to rest your poor heart." An hour later, the house was completely empty. Stephanie and Cynthia had left for their morning spa appointments. I needed them to think I was a broken, clueless old man living without a care in the world. I locked the heavy oak door of my private home office and turned on the bright desk lamp. My hands were steady now. I took the blue pill from my pocket and set it under the high-powered magnifying glass I used to inspect antique coins. To the naked eye, the capsule was an absolute masterpiece of a counterfeit. Under the sharp light, though, I spotted a microscopic seam along the plastic shell. The factory seal had been tampered with. I picked up a small steel letter opener and carefully pried the two halves apart. What spilled out onto the polished mahogany desk wasn't the familiar white powder of my prescription. It was a dense, granular, dark gray compound. I recognized the bitter, chemical scent almost immediately. Decades ago, back when I was building my logistics empire, I had consulted with hazardous materials experts to transport restricted chemical compounds. This wasn't blood pressure medication. It was a potent, undetectable, synthetic cardiac arrest agent. If I had swallowed that pill with my morning tea, my heart would have violently failed within 15 minutes. The local coroner would have chalked it up as a tragic natural heart attack, brought on by the severe stress of surviving a mountain accident. My own family had tried to poison me in my own bed while smiling sweetly and offering gentle words of comfort. A cold, absolute fury swept through me, burning away whatever grief was left, replacing it with a ruthless drive to dismantle them entirely. As I swept the lethal powder into a sterile glass vial to preserve it, I caught sight of a dark delivery van pulling up to the iron gates of my estate. I stepped over to the bay window, watching a uniformed courier walk up to the grand front entrance holding a padded mailing envelope. I quickly slipped out of my office, hurried down the main staircase, and reached the grand foyer, naïve, just as the heavy brass knocker sounded twice. When I opened the door, the young courier looked down at his digital clipboard. "Package. Signature sure required," he announced, handing me the glowing screen. "I'm her husband. I'll sign for it," I replied smoothly, scribbling an illegible mark on the pad. He handed over the envelope and walked back to his vehicle, completely unaware that he had just put a critical piece of evidence directly into my hands. I carried the brown package straight back to my secure office and sliced it open with the steel letter opener. Inside, wrapped in cheap bubble mailers, was an inexpensive prepaid burner phone. It had no protective case and no identifying marks. I pressed the power button, and the small screen lit up brightly. There was no passcode locking the home screen. The device contained a single unread text message from an anonymous, blocked number. I opened the notification and read the chilling words displayed in stark black letters. "The Denver hit failed. He made it home somehow. Use the blue pill today. We need him gone by Friday afternoon, before the major corporate board meeting." I waited until the house was completely still before setting my plan into motion. I told Cynthia that the lingering trauma of the mountain crash was causing me severe chest pain, and that I urgently needed to visit my personal cardiologist downtown. She immediately offered to accompany me, playing the devoted, worried wife to perfection. But I insisted that I just needed some quiet time alone to clear my head. I slid into the back seat of my dark Lincoln Town car and instructed my trusted driver to head toward the medical district. As soon as we were safely clear of the estate gates, I tapped on the heavy glass partition and gave him an entirely new destination. We drove in complete silence deep into the financial district, pulling into the highly secure underground parking garage beneath a massive glass skyscraper. Waiting for me in a shadowed corner, beside a gray, concrete pillar, was Jonathan Reed. Jonathan was my corporate attorney, and arguably one of the most ruthless legal minds in the city. Over the last 20 years, I had paid him millions of dollars for one specific reason. He never asked unnecessary questions, and he was fiercely loyal to the man's signing his retainer checks. I rolled down the tinted window, feeling the damp air of the garage brush against my face, and handed him the sterile glass vial containing the lethal dark powder. I need a complete, airtight chemical analysis of this compound by tonight, I told him, keeping my voice low and steady. And I need you to immediately set up a secure shadow trust, capable of moving all my personal liquid assets out of my primary accounts without raising any immediate red flags with the banks. Jonathan took the fragile vial, holding it up under the dim overhead light. His cold expression didn't shift a bit. He simply gave a firm nod, slipped it into his tailored jacket pocket, and walked toward the private executive elevators without saying a word. With the physical evidence handed off to the only lawyer I could trust, I moved straight into the next critical phase of my survival strategy. I desperately needed an insider ally. Someone brilliant. Someone with the intellectual horsepower to navigate the sheer complexity of my corporate financial network. Most importantly, I needed someone with zero loyalty or emotional attachment to Cynthia, Bradley, or Stephanie. And there was exactly one person on earth who fit that description. My estranged daughter, Natalie. She was 30 years old and currently ran a highly successful, cutting-edge architectural firm on the other side of the city. For years, I had foolishly sidelined her, pushing her away from the family business because I was blindly focused on Bradley as my sole heir. I had convinced myself that she was too fiercely independent, too headstrong to ever fall in line with my corporate vision. The bitter truth I was finally forced to accept was that she was entirely, unconditionally like me. She was a builder, a survivor, and a fighter who would never back down from an impossible challenge. I instructed my driver to head to her minimalist, modern offices. I walked straight past the sleek wooden reception desk, ignoring the confused receptionist calling out my name, and pushed open the heavy frosted glass door to her private corner office. Natalie was standing quietly beside a massive, illuminated drafting table, meticulously reviewing a complex set of structural blueprints. She slowly looked up and froze. She had intentionally skipped the fake morning drama at my Chicago estate. She had no idea that I was supposed to be dead in a mountain ravine, or that I had miraculously returned. She simply saw her deeply estranged father standing in the middle of her private office, for the first time in nearly 3 long, bitter years. I closed the heavy glass door behind me and turned the lock. Walking over to her side of the room, I did something I hadn't done since she was a little girl playing in our backyard. I swallowed my pride, and I apologized. I looked my brilliant daughter in the eye and told her I had been an arrogant fool. I told her I had been blinded by the illusion of a perfect family, that I had picked the wrong child, and that I had blindly placed my entire legacy in the wrong hands. Natalie didn't flinch. She didn't shed a tear, nor did she express a single moment of surprise at my sudden confession. She simply crossed her arms over her tailored shirt and waited for me to finish. Without another word, I reached into my jacket pocket and set the cheap plastic burner phone right in the center of her spotless desk. I slid the glass screen, unlocking the display to show her the anonymous text explicitly ordering my execution before Friday afternoon. She leaned forward, reading the digital message twice. Her expression remained completely cold, a flawless mask of calculated observation. "You aren't the only one who's been watching how they operate," she said quietly, turning her back to me and walking over to her desktop computer. She typed in a long, complex security passcode, opening a hidden, encrypted private server. She turned to me and laid out a shocking reality. For the past 8 consecutive months, she had been quietly, systematically auditing my logistics company from the outside. Her instincts had warned her that Bradley was greedily, illegally siphoning massive corporate funds. She turned the large display so I could see the undeniable proof, a hidden, detailed shadow ledger. Bradley wasn't just stealing a few $100,000 to fund his lavish lifestyle. He had been, systematically, draining the company's primary liquid operating assets and moving them directly into an untraceable offshore shell company. I stared blankly at the screen as she pulled up the actual ownership registry for that shell company. The entity receiving all my wealth was officially owned by Vincent Cross, the most vicious billionaire competitor in my entire industry. The man who had spent 40 years trying to destroy my logistics empire. But the final detail at the bottom of the screen made my breathing stop completely. The primary digital signature legally authorizing every single massive financial transfer to my worst enemy belonged to Cynthia. My own wife had knowingly signed away everything I had ever built. The ultimate betrayal was staring right back at me in the harsh glow of the monitor. For over 30 years, I had been completely blind. Natalie didn't waste time on empty words. She laid out a strategy. Over the next 3 hours inside her secure office, we mapped out the floor plan of my massive estate. She knew every blind spot and structural vulnerability because she had secretly studied the house when she first suspected financial fraud. We needed eyes and ears inside the mansion. Before we could strike back, we needed absolute proof of their conspiracy. With a single phone call, Natalie hired an elite team of former military surveillance specialists to bug my home. We just needed a window of time when the mansion would be empty. That opportunity came the very next afternoon. Cynthia walked into my office wearing an expensive dress, carrying that same artificial smile. She told me she, Bradley, and Stephanie were heading to the local country club for a special luncheon to celebrate my miraculous return. She kissed my forehead and told me to rest in the quiet house. I played my role to perfection, thanking her for her love. I watched from the second-floor window as my son drove them away. The moment their car cleared the main iron gates, I sent a secure text to Natalie. 10 minutes later, an unmarked white utility van pulled up the long driveway. 5 men dressed in plain gray work uniforms stepped out carrying heavy metal equipment cases. Natalie walked right behind them like a field commander stepping onto a battlefield. No, she directed the men with absolute authority, and they moved through my home with incredible precision. They installed military-grade, high-definition micro-cameras inside air conditioning vents, behind imported artwork, and within the intricate crystal chandeliers. I walked slowly through the grand hallways, supervising the installation, a suffocating weight pressing down on my chest. This was the house I had built to protect my family. I had paid for every brick and every piece of luxury furniture with my own sweat. Now, I was actively helping a covert tactical team bug my own sanctuary. I watched as a technician drilled a microscopic hole into the ornate molding of my living room, realizing the profound tragedy of my existence. I had become a ghost haunting my own life, a walking corpse wandering the halls of an empire that had been stolen by the people I loved most. Standing in the massive gourmet kitchen, watching them hide a tiny microphone beneath the granite countertops, I remembered all the joyful holiday dinners we had celebrated in that room. I remembered laughing with Bradley as he carved the Thanksgiving turkey. Now, every single memory was poisoned. They were all calculated lies, designed to keep me complacent while they drained my life force and plotted my execution. "Sir, we have a major problem," the lead technician whispered. He was standing in my private study, staring nervously at a diagnostic display connected to the main network router. I walked over and looked at the data. "What is it?" I asked, keeping my voice low. The technician pointed to a flashing red alert on the screen. "Your entire home wireless network has been breached," he explained, his voice tight. "Someone installed advanced tracking malware directly into the main firewall. They are monitoring your every move. Every email you send and every website you visit is being logged and forwarded to an external server." A cold chill ran down my spine. "Who installed it?" "Us," I asked. He pulled up the internal access logs, tracing the source of the malicious code. The digital signature belonged to a laptop registered directly under Stephanie's name. My sweet, elegant daughter-in-law wasn't just smiling at me over breakfast. She was actively spying on my digital footprint, waiting for me to make a mistake. "If we connect these new hidden cameras to your existing home network, she'll detect the data spike instantly," the technician warned. "She'll know we're watching them. We can't risk using the existing infrastructure." Natalie stepped forward, her architect's mind calculating a solution. "Don't use the house network," she commanded firmly. "Set up a completely isolated, closed-loop tactical system. Run the hardwired camera feeds directly through the interior walls into the basement. We will bypass the local internet entirely and transmit the encrypted footage straight to my firm's private servers." The tactical team shifted gears immediately, working frantically to route miles of micro-thin fiber optic cables through the dark spaces behind the drywall. Just as they secured the final connection point in the primary bedroom suite, Natalie's phone buzzed with a proximity alert. She looked down at the screen, her face draining of color. "They're back," she whispered anxiously. "The gate sensors were just triggered. They came back an hour early. We have less than 2 minutes before they walk through the front door." The team moved with terrifying efficiency. They grabbed their tools, wiped away every trace of dust, and vanished down the rear servants' staircase toward their van. Natalie gave me a sharp, firm nod before following them out the side service entrance. I was left standing alone in the center of the grand foyer. I could hear the tires of Bradley's car crunching over the gravel driveway. My heart slammed furiously against my ribs. I practically threw myself into my private study, pulled the door shut, collapsed onto the sofa, and grabbed a throw blanket, forcing my breathing into a slow, deep rhythm as I closed my eyes. I heard the heavy front door swing open. I heard Cynthia's laughter echoing down the hallway, accompanied by Stephanie and Bradley talking about their expensive lunch. I lay completely still, playing the role of an exhausted old man's resting. Deep inside my right ear, a microscopic earpiece provided by the tactical team crackled to life. Natalie's voice came through directly from her location across the city. "Dad, we have live video feeds from every unit," she whispered, her voice trembling with sudden shock. "You need to pull up camera 4 right now. It's Cynthia's private dressing room." I carefully reached beneath the blanket and pulled out my secure tablet. Opening the encrypted app, I tapped the 4th video feed, and high-definition color video popped up on the screen. Cynthia was standing alone in front of her large vanity mirror, her purse sitting open on the counter. My first thought was that she was looking at a medical test, but at her age, that was biologically impossible. I zoomed in on the feed, holding my breath in the dark room. She wasn't holding a medical device. She was holding a crisp sheet of paper, stamped with an official laboratory seal, a formal paternity DNA result. I stared at the glowing tablet screen, completely stunned as I watched the paper tremble in Cynthia's manicured hands. A paternity test. Through the microcamera. The bold lettering at the top of the lab document was clearly visible. My mind raced, trying to comprehend why my wife of 40 years was holding genetic test results. Bradley was 35 years old. We had never questioned his parentage. He had my nose, my jaw, or at least, that's what I had foolishly believed my entire adult life. I watched as Cynthia carefully folded the paper and tucked it deep into the lining of her leather handbag. She walked over to the heavy oak door of her dressing room and locked it with a sharp click, making absolute sure she was alone. Then, she reached into the hidden bottom drawer of her vanity and pulled out a cheap plastic burner phone, identical to the one I had intercepted from the courier that morning. My breath hitched. I pressed my index finger against the tiny earpiece, waiting for the surveillance microphones to capture the audio. The team had rigged the entire mansion with military-grade equipment. I could hear the faint, rhythmic tones as she dialed a long international number. She held the cheap plastic device to her ear, glancing nervously toward the locked door. The secure line connected, and a deep, raspy voice echoed directly in my ear, a voice I recognized instantly. It belonged to a man I had fought in brutal corporate boardrooms for over 4 decades. Vincent Cross. Vincent Cross was a ruthless billionaire logistics tycoon, and my absolute worst rival in the industry. We had spent our entire careers trying to utterly destroy each other. Was a man without a moral compass, a predator whose empire was built on hostile takeovers and ruined lives. Hearing his gravelly voice echoing inside my own home felt like a physical violation. Cynthia leaned forward, resting her elbows on the marble vanity. Her voice dropped to a soft, conspiratorial whisper that made my stomach turn. "The plan is moving forward perfectly, Vincent," she murmured, her tone dripping with a dark, twisted affection I hadn't heard in decades. "Harrison is fading fast. The staged crash broke his spirit, and the blue pill is finally doing its job. He's weak, exhausted, and completely clueless. He thinks he just had a narrow escape." Vincent let out a low, cruel chuckle on the other end of the line. "Good work, my love," he replied, his voice like rough sandpaper. "And the merger documents, are they completely finalized?" Cynthia smiled at her reflection in the mirror. "Everything is set, Vincent," she whispered. "Bradley is ready to sign the final transition papers on Friday afternoon. The moment Harrison is officially out of the picture, our son will finally inherit what was always rightfully yours. He'll hand you the keys to the entire Wright logistics empire on a silver platter." My chest tightened so painfully, I thought my heart was going to burst. The darkened room around me began to spin violently. The leather sofa, the antique bookshelves, the thick Persian rugs, everything blurred into a dizzying nightmare. Our son. Cynthia had just referred to Bradley as their son while speaking to my greatest enemy. The devastating truth hit me with the force of a runaway freight train. Bradley wasn't my biological child. He was Vincent Cross's son. My wife had been sleeping with my greatest rival behind my back for nearly 40 years. She had gotten pregnant and passed the child off as my own flesh and blood. A Trojan horse I had spent 35 years funding, raising, and loving deeply. A trap perfectly engineered to destroy me from the inside out. I had paid for his elite private schools. I had funded his Ivy League education. I had spent decades patiently grooming him to take over the empire I built with my own hands. Every baseball game I had attended, every proud graduation embrace, every single moment of fatherly love I had given him, had been a calculated lie. They had planted a parasite in my home, and I had spent my life feeding it. I gripped the edges of the tablet, my knuckles turning completely white. The betrayal was so deep, so incomprehensible, that I couldn't even manage a single tear. There was no grief left inside my body, only a cold, dark, terrifying void. I was a man who had survived everything the business world could throw at him, only to be slaughtered at his own dinner table by the people closest to him. I forced myself to keep listening to the live feed. I needed to know exactly how deep this toxic infestation went. I needed every single detail of their crime before I burned their entire world to the ground. Vincent spoke again, his voice stiff and demanding. Make sure Bradley does exactly what he's told Cynthia. He's been acting erratic lately, and I don't like erratic behavior when there's $150 million on the line. Cynthia nodded quickly, even though he couldn't see her. He's just stressed, Vincent, she assured him smoothly. He'll perform flawlessly on Friday. You'll finally have absolute, total ownership of everything Harrison built. She blew a light kiss into the receiver, ended the call, and hid the cheap plastic phone back in the bottom of her vanity drawer. I sat in the dark study, trying to stabilize my ragged breathing. Just as I thought the terrible revelations were over, the heavy oak door to Cynthia's dressing room clicked open on the video feed. Someone was frantically knocking at the entrance to the primary bedroom suite. Cynthia quickly smoothed her hair and unlocked the door. It was Bradley. He stepped into the room, pale, looking utterly exhausted and visibly terrified. He shut the solid wood door behind him and locked it tight once again. "Mom, we've got a massive problem," he whispered, his voice trembling with raw panic. "The body in the flooded quarry is staying down, exactly like we planned. The heavy canvas tarp and the metal weights have it pinned deep in the cold mud. But Vincent is getting extremely suspicious. He's been blowing up my secure line all morning, demanding constant updates." Cynthia grabbed his broad shoulders, looking utterly alarmed. "What are you talking about, Bradley?" she demanded. "What is Vincent suspicious about?" Bradley swallowed hard, a flash of pure, unadulterated terror crossing his pale face. "He doesn't know I ended his top private fixer, Mom," he stammered. "If my real biological father finds out I stole that $3 million hit fund for myself, he'll destroy us both." The audio feed cut out, but the terrifying echo of Bradley's confession continued to bounce off the walls of my study. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place with chilling clarity. Bradley hadn't just plotted to end my life and steal my empire. He had actively betrayed his own biological father. Vincent Cross had hired an elite corporate hitman to orchestrate my accident on that dangerous mountain road in Colorado. He had paid $3 million in cash to guarantee my demise. But Bradley, driven by a sickening greed that eclipsed even his fake loyalty to his real father, had intercepted the plan. He had eliminated Vincent's operative, pocketed the bounty for himself, and transported the body all the way back to Chicago. And the most vicious part of his scheme was his choice of a site, sinking the weighted package deep into the cold waters of my restricted limestone quarry. He was framing me. If local authorities ever discovered that decaying body deep in the mud, the physical evidence would lead investigators directly to my front door. If the Colorado hit failed, my fake son was fully prepared to let me rot in a federal prison cell for the rest of my life. I gripped the edge of my mahogany desk so tightly, my knuckles turned white in the dim light. A sharp, violent physical pain radiated from deep within my chest. This wasn't the dramatic performance I had put on over the last 24 hours. This was the suffocating weight of a shattered reality, crushing my lungs. I closed my tired eyes, vividly remembering the long, grueling 40 years of sacrifice I had willingly made to build this logistics empire from nothing. I remembered freezing winter mornings, driving a rusted delivery truck with a broken heater. My bare hands cracked and bleeding against the icy steering wheel. I remembered endless, sleepless nights, hunched over kitchen tables, poring over freight manifests and financial ledgers until my vision blurred, desperately trying to guarantee a permanent financial future for my family. I had meticulously built a towering monument of immense wealth, stability, and absolute security. I just wanted to create a perfect haven where my wife and child would never experience the bitter poverty I had endured as a boy. Sitting alone in the dark shadows of my study, holding my aching chest, I realized my beautiful haven had been completely corrupted from the very beginning. My decades of hard work, endless personal sacrifices, and unconditional fatherly love had been systematically reduced to a brutal slaughterhouse for pure, unadulterated greed. My first raw instinct was to pick up the desk phone, dial emergency services, and have a fully armed tactical unit raid the estate immediately. I had encrypted digital recordings. I had live high-definition video feeds. I had a chilling audio confession to a cold-blooded murder. I could end their sickening farce right now and watch them dragged out of my estate in shiny metal handcuffs. But cold, calculated business logic quickly snuffed out that emotional impulse. Calling the local police tonight was far too simple and far too risky. Vincent Cross was a ruthless billionaire with deep political influence, an army of corporate defense attorneys, and the terrifying power to manipulate any legal narrative. Cynthia and Bradley could easily spin the truth, claiming the surveillance recordings were illegally obtained, or asserting that the emotional trauma from my near-fatal crash had left me dangerously paranoid. I needed a legal victory that was airtight, public, and absolute in its devastation. I pressed my index finger against the micro earpiece hidden deep inside my ear. I established a secure, encrypted audio link written directly to Natalie and my attorney, Jonathan Reed, who were waiting quietly on the other end of the closed-loop network. I quietly whispered the entire horrifying truth to them, detailing the shocking biological betrayal and the brutal murder at the flooded quarry. Over the next agonizing hour, we mapped out a lethal, foolproof counter-strategy. We made a deliberate choice not to confront them tonight. Isolated inside the house, we wouldn't corner them with the overwhelming evidence of their crimes. Instead, we would hand them the exact illusion they were desperate for, the comforting belief that they had achieved total, unposed victory. We would give them a broken, exhausted, dying old man who was finally ready to hand over the golden keys to his kingdom for good. I stood up from the leather sofa, taking a moment to mentally prepare for the most critical performance of my life. I deliberately unbuttoned my stiff collar, disheveled my silver hair, and forced my breathing into a shallow, rapid rhythm. I needed to physically look like a fragile man whose body was failing under severe stress and deteriorating cardiovascular health. I unlocked the heavy oak door of my study and dragged my feet out into the bright main hallway of the second floor. I let my left leg trail awkwardly against the polished hardwood. I slouched my right shoulder, clutching at the hallway wall for physical support. I let out a loud, painful, raspy groan, my trembling right hand clutching tightly at the left side of my chest. I was putting on an absolute masterclass of a performance, playing an exhausted, dying old man currently suffering a debilitating stroke. The loud, distressing noise, echoing down the quiet hallway, immediately caught their panicked attention. The doubled doors of the primary suite burst open. Bradley sprinted down the long corridor, his pale face a perfect mask of fake, desperate, loving concern. He reached out eagerly, grabbing my slumping shoulders to prevent my heavy body from collapsing onto the imported Persian rug. He supported my weight, his surprisingly powerful grip clamping down on my arm with suffocating pressure. A touch that made my empty stomach turn with pure disgust. I looked deep into his dark eyes, letting my own tired gaze roll back slightly, playing the tragic, broken victim to absolute perfection. As he leaned in close to support my falling weight, his mask slipped for a microscopic second. A dark, triumphant, purely evil smirk flashed across his pale face, completely hidden from his anxious mother, running frantically up the hallway behind him. He pulled me tight against his chest, actively pretending to be the heroic son, saving my fragile life during a sudden medical emergency. He leaned down, pressing his mouth against my ear. "It's time to step aside, Dad," he whispered softly, his low voice dripping with cold, triumphant poison. That twisted smile was the ultimate confirmation of his absolute betrayal. I let my body go completely limp against him, acting as if the sudden medical event had drained whatever remaining strength I had left. He guided me into the dark study and laid me on the leather sofa, playing the dutiful son to the hilt. Cynthia rushed in behind us, launching into her own hysterical performance. "Harrison, what's happening?" she cried, dropping to her knees and grabbing my hand. I kept my breathing extremely shallow, letting a weak, trembling groan escape my dry lips. "My heart is just so tired, Cynthia," I whispered, keeping my voice hollow and broken. "That mountain accident took everything out of me. I need to rest." Stephanie appeared carrying a silver tray with a bowl of steaming soup and a crystal saucer. She stepped forward with a gentle, soothing smile that made my stomach churn. "You need to eat something, Harrison," she murmured softly, setting the tray on the low coffee table. "I made you some warm soup to help you get your strength back, and we need to make sure you take your evening medication so your heart rate can stabilize." I knew exactly what was inside that brand new blue capsule sitting on the crystal saucer. It was another dose of the undetectable synthetic cardiac agent designed to ensure my heart stopped beating before Friday morning. I played the docile, broken, old man flawlessly. Stephanie sat on the edge of the sofa, carefully dipping a silver spoon into the hot soup. She brought it to my lips, blowing gently on it. I opened my mouth to let her feed me, but deliberately let a large portion of the broth spill onto my stained shirt. "Oh, I'm so sorry, Harrison," she cooed softly, grabbing a thick white napkin to dab at my face. The moment she was distracted, I quickly spat the soup into a coffee mug, hidden beside the couch cushions. I repeated this exhausting charade for 10 minutes, pretending to swallow, and quietly emptying my mouth whenever she turned her head. When the bowl was finally empty, she handed me a glass of water and the lethal blue pill. I placed the capsule on my tongue, took a large gulp of water, and immediately faked a violent coughing fit. Bringing my hand to my mouth, I turned away from them, smoothly dropping the toxic pill deep into my shirt pocket. "There now." Stephanie, oblivious to the deception, "You're going to feel so much better very soon." Soon. She picked up the empty silver tray and quietly following close behind, with Cynthia following close behind. I was finally left completely alone with the man who wanted me dead. Bradley stood near the large window, looking down at the dark, sprawling estate I had paid for. He turned around slowly, walked over to my desk, and picked up a heavy, leather-bound binder he had brought into the room earlier. He carried it over to the sofa, sitting heavily in the armchair facing me. "We need to have a difficult conversation," he said with manufactured gravity. "Your health is deteriorating rapidly. You just had a terrible scare right in front of us." I looked up at him with watery, exhausted eyes, letting my hand tremble visibly against the leather cushion. I know, Bradley," I whispered, keeping my voice raspy and frail. "I can feel my body giving out on me. I don't have much time left." He gave a slow nod, a mask of tragic acceptance firmly in place. "Which is why I took the liberty of calling Jonathan Reed to draft these legal documents." He lied smoothly, having no idea that Jonathan and I were already working together to orchestrate his downfall. He opened the heavy binder, revealing a thick stack of official corporate handover papers. Right on top of the crisp white sheets rested a gold-plated fountain pen. These papers legally transfer total executive control of the logistics empire directly to me, he explained, pointing toward the signature lines. "It also grants me full power of attorney over your financial estate, including the offshore emergency accounts. That way, you don't have to feel stressed. You can just rest, Dad. I'll handle the heavy burden of the company." I stared at the documents, a cold, sharp fury burning deep in my chest. He was trying to legally steal my life's work, while I was still breathing. I remembered the long, agonizing 40 years it had taken me to build this massive enterprise. I had foolishly believed I was grooming a brilliant successor, but I had actually been funding the lavish lifestyle of a parasitic Trojan horse, biologically engineered by my worst rival to destroy my empire from the inside out. His massive ego had blinded him to the trap. He genuinely believed he had outsmarted the old man who had funded his entire existence. I slowly reached out a trembling hand, picking up the heavy gold pen. I let the metal tip hover right above the dotted signature line. Bradley leaned forward, his dark eyes flashing with unvarnished greed. At the thought of taking control of $150 million, he was practically salivating. Then, I abruptly tossed the gold pen onto the table, letting out a long, heavy sigh. I looked up at him with tired eyes, playing the broken tycoon to absolute perfection. "I'll sign them, Bradley," I whispered, my voice cracking with fake emotion. "But I can't just sign them in a dark corner like a defeated old man. I built this company from a rusted delivery truck with my own 2 hands. If I'm finally passing the torch to my only son, I want to do it with absolute honor." He knit his brows, clearly annoyed by the unexpected delay, but his overwhelming arrogance kept him from sensing any real danger. "What exactly are you proposing, Dad?" he asked, trying to keep his tone patient. "I want to sign these papers tomorrow morning at corporate headquarters," I answered, leaning my head back. "I want to sign them officially in front of the entire executive board. I want everyone to see me proudly pass the company to you. I want to step down with dignity." Bradley stared at me for a long, tense moment before giving a slow nod. "All right, Dad," he agreed. "We'll do it entirely your way." He stood up and walked out of the dark study. Later that night, my tactical security team finally retrieved the heavy body from the icy, flooded quarry. Natalie immediately sent me a clear digital photo of a waterlogged leather wallet found on the corpse. The official identification inside proved that the dead man wasn't just an anonymous corporate hitman. He was Vincent Cross's legitimate youngest son. Bradley hadn't just ended a random mobster. Driven by pure, unadulterated greed, he had murdered his own biological half-brother. That horrific truth echoed in my mind throughout the agonizing night. I lay quietly in the massive bed, listening to the soft, rhythmic breathing of Cynthia beside me. She slept peacefully, like a woman who believed she had conquered the world. She had no idea that her entire empire of lies was about to crumble to dust. It was early Friday morning, when the first pale glimmers of sunlight crept through the heavy silk drapes in our master bedroom. Right then, I knew. The day of reckoning had finally arrived. Today was the day I'd take back the life they'd stolen from me. I slipped out from under the warm covers and walked into my walk-in closet, standing before row after row of custom designer suits. For the last 3 days, I'd intentionally stayed in soft, oversized pajamas, putting on a flawless performance as a frail, bedridden victim recovering from a heart attack. But today, I was carrying out a corporate execution. And I needed my armor. I reached deep into the back of the closet and pulled out a dark Tom Ford suit, pairing it with a crisp white dress shirt and a tie the color of deep crimson blood. As I buttoned the cufflinks, my 70-year-old hands didn't shake once. The debilitating chest pains and emotional shock from days ago were completely gone. In their place was something ice-cold, calculated, and absolute. I looked at my reflection in the full-length mirror. Standing there was the same ruthless titan who built a massive international logistics empire from absolute nothing. But I couldn't let them see him just yet. This trap required one final, perfect act. I walked over to the corner of the closet and picked up a heavy, polished wooden cane. I deliberately let my shoulders slouch and forced my back into an unnatural bend. I leaned my weight onto the wood, letting my left leg drag slightly across the plush carpet. Softening my sharp gaze, I forced my face into an expression of deep exhaustion and quiet defeat. I wasn't Harrison Wright, the billionaire conqueror. I was Harrison Wright, the broken old man ready to surrender his kingdom. Leaning heavily on the cane, I shuffled back into the bedroom. Cynthia was awake, sitting gracefully at her vanity. When she saw me standing there in my suit, she turned around and offered a sweet, practiced smile. "Oh, Harrison," she purred, her voice dripping with artificial warmth. "You look handsome, my love. But are you sure you have the strength for this today? We could so easily postpone the board meeting and have the notary come directly to the house." I shook my head, slowly, forcing a brave but thoroughly exhausted smile. "No, Cynthia," I rasped, keeping my voice faint. "I need to do this properly. When I hand over the keys to our son, I want to look the board members in the eyes." Cynthia stood up from her vanity and walked over to me, her navy blue dress accentuating her figure. Stopping just inches away, she gently placed her hand on my lapel, smoothing my collar and straightening my crimson tie. Her touch felt like a snake bite, but I forced myself to stand completely still. I looked into her eyes, the exact same eyes that had looked back at me with fake devotion on our wedding day. Hidden beneath her skin was 35 years of pure deception. Decades of lies, millions stolen, secret calls to my biggest rival, and the toxic poison she'd been feeding me. She leaned in and kissed my cheek, her expensive perfume filling my nose. "You're doing the right thing, dear," she lied flawlessly, wearing her mask of a devoted wife. "You've worked so hard your whole life. It's finally time for you to rest." I met her gaze, feeling a cold, dark fury burning in my chest. In return, I gave her a weak, trembling smile. "I know I am, Cynthia," I whispered. "Today, everyone gets exactly what they deserve." She patted my chest affectionately, completely unaware that she had just signed her own fate. We made our way downstairs, me leaning heavily on the wooden cane with every step. Bradley was already waiting in the grand foyer, dressed in a tailored suit, looking sharp and arrogant. He rushed forward to grab my arm for the final 3 steps, playing the dutiful son. "Take it easy, Dad," he said smoothly, his dark eyes flickering with pure greed. "The entire board is waiting." Outside, my driver was waiting in the running Lincoln Town car. Bradley practically lifted me into the back seat, treating me like fragile glass. Cynthia slid in right beside me while Bradley took the front passenger seat. The heavy doors closed, shutting out the cool morning air. The long drive into the financial district was pure psychological torture. The car was dead silent, save for the low hum of the engine and classical music playing softly through the speakers. Trapped in the back, sitting between 2 people who had conspired to destroy me, I watched Chicago glide past the dark windows. The city I'd conquered through decades of cutthroat negotiations and impossible sacrifices. I glanced sideways at Cynthia as she scrolled through her phone, checking her offshore accounts. I looked at the back of Bradley's styled head, knowing his hands carried invisible blood. When the car finally pulled up to our glass-fronted corporate headquarters, the morning rush was in full swing. The driver held the door, and Bradley rushed to help me out. I gripped the brass handle of my cane and planted my feet on the cold pavement. We walked through the heavy glass doors into the grand marble lobby. My eyes cut straight across the room toward the reception desk. Standing there in the morning rush, sharp as a tack in a tailored black suit, was Natalie, my loyal daughter. She looked like a trained operative waiting for her signal. We locked eyes across the massive lobby. No words were exchanged, no dramatic gestures made. Just a subtle, silent nod. The trap was fully set. I kept my head down and shoulders slouched, maintaining the illusion of a broken man as Bradley guided me toward the private elevator to the 50th floor. Cynthia walked close beside me, clutching her handbag and offering fake smiles to employees passing us by. The elevator doors chimed and closed, sending us up in total silence. I watched the floor numbers light up, feeling a heavy wave of anticipation building in my chest. They thought they were bringing an aging, defeated man to his final surrender. In reality, they were walking straight into an execution chamber. The doors slid open on the 50th floor, revealing the boardroom double doors wide open. Voices floated into the hallway. Leaning hard on my cane, I took slow, deliberate steps across the threshold. The massive boardroom was packed. The solid mahogany table dominated the center of the room, surrounded by high-backed leather chairs. Every single member of the board was seated, men and women I'd handpicked over decades. When I entered, they looked up with a mix of concern and respect. Stephanie, sitting near the head of the table with a look of rehearsed gravity, quickly stood up to pull out my chair. I shuffled over, sinking into the leather with a soft, raspy sigh. Bradley sat to my right, Cynthia to my left. An absolute silence fell over the room. I looked down at the mahogany surface. Placed perfectly in the center was a thick stack of corporate transfer documents, tagged with yellow sticky notes, pointing exactly where I needed to sign away my life's work. Bradley leaned in, his eyes shining with barely hidden excitement. "Whenever you're ready, Dad," he whispered, his voice dripping with false concern. The board members leaned forward. But just as I was about to speak, a commotion at the back of the room cut me off. The double doors swung open, and a tall figure stepped confidently into the room. A collective gasp echoed amongst the directors. It was Vincent Cross, my fiercest industry rival, and the biological father of the man sitting to my right. He wore a custom suit, a smirk on his face that made him look like a shark circling wounded prey. "Vincent, what are you doing here?" one board member demanded, standing up in anger. "You have no right to be in this building." Vincent chuckled, holding up his hands. "Calm down, everyone," he announced, his voice carrying easily. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here as a strategic partner, to witness this historic transfer of power." He walked toward the front of the room, his eyes locked on mine. "Your son Bradley invited me," he explained, gesturing to the man on my right. "We've been discussing a joint venture between our company as CEO." Murmurs broke out among the board. Murmurs broke out among the board. They knew the bitter rivalry between my empire and Vincent Cross. A sudden partnership made no sense, but stunned by my failing health, no one dared challenge it. I looked straight at Vincent, watching him take a seat in the corner. He thought he'd won. He truly believed his 35 years of deception had reached its ultimate victory. He'd planted his son in my home, slept with my wife, and orchestrated a takeover of my company without spending a single dime of his own money. I turned my head slightly toward my wife. Cynthia was looking down at her manicured hands, a faint smile playing on her lips. Her long game had worked perfectly, and now she was minutes away from claiming her reward. Bradley reached into his suit jacket, pulled out a heavy gold pen, and placed it on the table next to the documents. "It's time, Dad," he urged softly. "Just sign on the marked tabs, and you can finally rest." He was practically drooling at the thought of absolute control. The greed radiating off him was palpable. I stared at the shiny gold pen reflecting the overhead lights. Slowly, my hand reached out and picked it up. I ran my fingers over the cold metal, looking down at the bold black letters declaring my permanent resignation. The room was so quiet I could hear the ticking of my watch. Every eye was glued to my hand, waiting for ink to hit paper. I held the pen hovering just a fraction of an inch above the line. I let that silence hang for 10 unbearable seconds. Then my trembling stopped. My hand turned to solid rock. With a sharp, decisive click, I set the pen back down on the table. I didn't sign a single letter. Instead, I placed both hands flat on the polished wood and pushed myself up out of the leather chair. I didn't struggle. I didn't reach for my cane. I stood up straight, shoulders back, chin high. The slouching posture of a dying old man vanished entirely, replaced by the commanding presence of the titan who built this empire from scratch. Shock rippled across the room. Bradley stared up at me, his jaw dropping in absolute confusion. Cynthia shrank into her chair, her fake smile evaporating into a mask of sheer terror. Even Vincent Cross lost his smirk, his hands gripping his armrests. I looked down, grabbed the wooden cane, and tossed it into the center of the table with a loud clatter. Then, I reached deep into my jacket and pulled out a small, black electronic remote. Holding it up for everyone to see, I pressed the red button in the center. A loud, sharp click echoed through the room, followed by the heavy thud of military-grade electromagnetic locks engaging. The doors sealed shut. The trap had sprung. No one was leaving. The heavy thud of the locks resonated like a judge's final gavel. For a fraction of a second, The room plunged into a suffocating silence. The 50 senior directors could only stare at the heavy double doors, trying to process what had just happened. I stood tall at the head of the table, feeling every trace of my pretense melt away. After days of forced slouching and shuffling, standing straight sent a surge of adrenaline through my veins. I looked down at the gold pen resting on the white transfer papers. Bradley was still sitting to my right, his hand frozen halfway toward the documents. His face a mask of total confusion. He looked like a predator that had just realized it walked willingly into a steel cage. I reached out and gently pushed the thick stack of legal papers, sliding them across the smooth wood until they stopped right in front of him. I took a deep breath of the cool, filtered air, letting my real voice ring out for the first time in days. "I'm not signing a damn thing," I announced, my deep voice carrying the exact same unyielding authority from when I built this $150 million logistics empire out of a single beat-up truck. My voice hit the directors with physical force. Cynthia recoiled in her chair, her manicured hands rushing to cover her mouth as her 35-year illusion began to shatter. Vincent Cross, who had walked in expecting a victory lap, gripped his armrests so hard his knuckles turned white. His arrogant smirk vanished, replaced by a dark cloud of paranoia. They had all come here, eager to feast on the remains of a defeated old titan. Instead, they were locked in a vault with a man ready to burn their whole fraudulent world to the ground. Bradley tried desperately to salvage his crumbling narrative. He shoved his chair back, standing up and waving his hands wildly to gain sympathy from the bewildered board. "He needs medical attention right now," Bradley yelled, his voice cracking with panicked concern. "Please, everyone, you have to understand. The trauma from the crash completely fractured his mind. He's having a severe episode. He's clearly experiencing another mini-stroke right in front of us." He reached out to grab my shoulder, trying to physically force me back into the chair. "Don't touch me," I snapped. My voice struck like a whip in the silent room. He froze instantly, his hand hovering inches from my jacket. I stared directly into his eyes, refusing to look away, while slipping my right hand into my inner pocket. The board held their breath, completely unsure if they were witnessing a tragedy or the terrifying resurrection of their legendary CEO. My fingers wrapped around the custom digital transmitter resting in my jacket, my thumb finding the main activation switch. "Let's bring an end to this pathetic, sickening charade," I declared, my gaze locked on my fake son's rapidly pale face. "You all came here to witness the final transfer of my company and my estate. You will see a handover today, but it will be a transfer to the absolute, undeniable truth." I pressed the central button on the remote. Above us, seamless ceiling panels slid open with a soft, mechanical hum. 3 massive high-definition projection screens lowered silently into the center of the room, locking into place with perfect precision. Automatic blinds dropped immediately, plunging the massive room into a dramatic darkness before the digital projectors flared to life. The board members gasped as the massive screens illuminated the room with crystal-clear surveillance footage. It wasn't a chart of quarterly earnings or a presentation on logistics. It was a live feed from inside the master suite of my Chicago estate. The glowing timestamp in the corner showed the footage was taken yesterday morning, right after I'd faked my severe physical collapse. The silent HD video began to play, displaying the undeniable reality of my family's ultimate betrayal. The screen showed the heavy wooden door of the bedroom opening. Stephanie, my elegant daughter-in-law, walked confidently into the frame, holding a silver tray with a steaming cup of herbal tea and my daily blood pressure medication. The board members leaned forward, mesmerized. The camera angle provided a completely unobstructed line of sight to her manicured hands. In absolute silence, we watched Stephanie set the silver tray on the nightstand. We watched her glance casually over her shoulder to make sure the hallway was clear. Then, the entire room watched her reach deep into her pocket and pull out an identical fake blue capsule. The massive screen showed her smoothly swapping my legitimate heart medication for a potent, undetectable substance designed to trigger cardiac arrest. A collective gasp of horror erupted from the directors. Several men cursed in pure shock, while others covered their faces. The white light from the screen illuminated Stephanie, sitting near the table. Her polished mask was completely gone, leaving behind raw, animalistic terror. Her face drained of color as she shoved her heavy chair back, completely dropping her act. Sobbing hysterically, she lunged for the double doors, rattling the heavy brass handles. She pulled with all her strength, ignoring the sound of her expensive dress tearing, but the heavy electromagnetic locks didn't budge. She was trapped in the execution chamber, with the very man she had tried to eliminate. I let my daughter-in-law's absolute panic settle over the room. For several long, agonizing seconds, board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, whispering in extreme shock, unable to grasp the depth of betrayal unfolding before them. I raised my hand slightly, and the room fell silent again. I pressed a second button on the remote. The footage of Stephanie frozen on the screen vanished, replaced instantly by a new recording. This time, the hidden camera revealed the luxurious interior of Cynthia's private dressing room. In absolute silence, the directors watched my wife of 40 years standing in front of her vanity mirror. Her hands held a crisp piece of official lab paper. I zoomed in on the image, projecting the document across the wall so everyone could read the bold black letters at the top. An official genetic paternity test. Another sharp gasp echoed through the room. Senior directors read the shocking, undeniable results of the DNA analysis. Cynthia let out a choked scream from her seat. She slammed her trembling hands over her pale face, shaking her head as if she could magically deny the physical evidence displayed before all her professional peers. But I wasn't finished dismantling her lie. I clicked another button on the black remote. High-definition audio from tactical microphones filled the room. My wife's voice echoed through the speakers, dripping with a dark, twisted tenderness I'd never heard her use. "The plan is moving forward perfectly, Vincent," her recorded voice whispered into a burner phone. "Harrison is declining rapidly. The fake crash completely broke his spirit, and the blue pills are finally working. He thinks he just narrowly survived." Every senior director turned to look directly at Vincent Cross. The arrogant smirk he'd worn since walking through the doors was long gone. He sat frozen in his chair, his dark eyes wide with primitive fear. The recording played on, relentlessly exposing every tragic layer of their 35-year deception. "Everything is set, Vincent," Cynthia's voice purred overhead. "Bradley is ready to sign the transition documents on Friday afternoon. The moment Harrison officially steps down, our son will finally inherit what was always meant to be yours. He's going to hand you the keys to the entire Wright logistics empire on a silver platter." With a sharp click, I stopped the audio playback, letting a heavy, suffocating silence return to the room. I turned my head very slowly, locking my gaze on Vincent Cross. The ruthless billionaire looked like a man who had stepped on a landmine. I walked around the edge of the long mahogany tea table, my dress shoes echoing loudly on the hard floor. "Congratulations, Vincent," I said smoothly, keeping my voice calm, icy, and razor-sharp. "You managed to plant your child in my home. You managed to orchestrate a 35-year affair under my nose, while I was busy building an empire." I watched the board members stare at him with absolute disgust as his thick throat swallowed hard. "You managed to fool a man who blindly trusted his family," I continued, my voice bouncing off the high glass windows. "But you made one fatal, unforgivable mistake in your grand design." I stopped walking and pointed directly at the sweating, terrified man sitting to my right. "You should have taught him something about loyalty." Bradley was hyperventilating now, his chest heaving. It was hitting him that his entire lavish existence, built on fraud, was being systematically disassembled in front of the city's most powerful elite. He looked frantically at his biological father across the room, then back up at me, hopelessly trapped in a nightmare of his own making. I walked back to the head of the table and held up the small digital remote one last time. Looking down at Bradley, I saw the raw horror radiating from his pale face. "You really thought you were the smartest person in the room," I said quietly, letting him hear the deep disappointment in my voice. "You arrogant boy. You actually thought you could outsmart the man who raised you, while outsmarting the man who secretly created you. You thought you could play us both and walk away an extraordinarily wealthy man." I pressed the final red button on the remote. A new audio file blasted through the speakers, cutting through the thick tension. It was Bradley's panicked voice, secretly recorded just minutes after Cynthia had ended her private call with Vincent. "Mom, we have a massive problem." His voice trembled with unadulterated panic. "The body in the flooded quarry is sinking to the bottom, just like we planned. The heavy tarp and weights are holding it deep in the mud. But Vincent is getting extremely suspicious. He's been calling my secure line all morning demanding updates." The directors held their breath, staring at Bradley in pure horror, as his own recorded confession condemned him forever. Vincent Cross lunged forward in his chair, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson as he listened to his biological son's treacherous words. "He doesn't know I eliminated his top fixer, Mom," the recording continued, sealing Bradley's fate. "If my real father ever finds out I kept that $3 million of hit money for myself, he'll destroy us both." The final words of the secret recording hung heavy in the icy air of the locked boardroom. The silence that followed was deafening. Bradley slowly lowered his trembling head onto the polished mahogany table, realizing his own greed had dug his grave. I stood in silence, watching my enemies crumble. Vincent Cross sat completely paralyzed. The arrogant billionaire who had spent his career manipulating markets could not process the devastating weight of that recording. He slowly turned his head away from the screens and locked his dark, furious eyes onto his biological son's trembling form. The businessman's polished facade cracked completely. The healthy color drained from his face, leaving behind a sickly gray. His broad shoulders heaved with shallow breaths as his mind desperately tried to reject the awful truth. The elite fixer he'd hired to execute my elimination in the snowy Colorado mountains wasn't just a mercenary. He was a trusted operative. Vincent pressed his large, trembling hands onto the table and pushed his heavy frame up. He stood tall, his towering shadow falling across the legal documents scattered on the wood. Bradley shrank back into his chair, trying desperately to put distance between himself and the furious man standing just feet away. The silence inside the glass boardroom was so thick The faint mechanical hum of the HD projectors sounded like a roaring jet engine. Vincent opened his mouth, but the words seemed to choke him before they could even escape his throat. His face twisted into a horrifying mask of sheer terror and raw, instinctual grief. When he finally managed to force a sound from his chest, his voice was raspy, completely stripped of its usual polished corporate shine. It was a low, terrifying guttural roar that vibrated off the high ceiling. "The private fixer you cold-bloodedly eliminated," he whispered, his voice trembling with grief and absolute fury. "That young man wasn't just some nameless hired gun, you greedy, foolish idiot. That young man was my legitimate, biological youngest son." The crushing weight of that shocking revelation hit Bradley with the force of an out-of-control freight train. His eyes went wide, his jaw dropped, and he fell into total shock and disbelief. He had foolishly assumed he was just taking out a random, dangerous operative to secure a massive financial payout for himself. He had no idea he had ended the life of his own biological half-brother and dumped his cold body into the icy mud of an abandoned limestone quarry. Before Bradley could even try to spin a pathetic excuse or beg for mercy, the fragile tension in the room snapped. The wealthy villains turned on each other with terrifying ferocity. Vincent let out a deafening, anguished roar and lunged aggressively across the wide mahogany table. As he threw his entire weight forward, his expensive designer suit jacket ripped loudly along the seams, sending heavy crystal water carafes and thick leather binders shattering across the room. He reached over the polished wood, his broad hands stretched out like claws, locking onto Bradley's throat with terrifying speed and devastating accuracy. His thick fingers squeezed around his biological son's pale neck in a crushing grip, cutting off his air supply instantly. Bradley made a horrible choking sound and thrashed backward violently, sending his heavy leather chair flipping over. Both men crashed hard onto the expensive rug in a chaotic tangle of limbs and tearing fabric. The refined boardroom had transformed into a brutal arena in a matter of seconds. Cynthia broke the remaining silence with a sharp, hysterical scream, leaping out of her seat. She threw herself toward the two struggling men, frantically clawing at Vincent's broad shoulders in a desperate, useless attempt to save the son she had spent decades plotting for. "Please, Vincent, stop!" she wailed, her perfectly styled hair falling wildly across her face as her manicured nails scraped helplessly against his heavy jacket. "You're going to end him. Please, let him go." But the grieving billionaire completely ignored her desperate pleas, entirely consumed by a blinding cloud of vengeance. Stephanie, my once calm and elegant daughter-in-law, scrambled backward on all fours until her back slammed against the secure glass wall of the locked room. She curled her trembling body into a tight defensive ball in the dark corner, pressing her hands tightly over her ears. She was openly sobbing, paralyzed by the raw violence unfolding just feet from her torn silk dress. The 50 senior board members reacted in unified panic. Several older men yelled urgently for someone to intervene, while others literally climbed over heavy leather chairs to escape the chaotic center of the room. The well-dressed executives pressed themselves against the locked magnetic doors, frantically pushing their hands against the heavy wood, but there was no exit. I stood completely still at the head of the long table, my arms loosely crossed over my chest, leaning against the smooth wood. I didn't flinch. I didn't yell. I simply watched as the devastating consequences of their own massive greed completely consumed them. I watched the fake family I had, once foolishly loved, tear itself apart. I deliberately let them struggle on the floor for 30 full seconds, watching deep purple bruises quickly form, and listening to the desperate gasps of my enemies receiving their poetic punishment. 30 seconds was the precise amount of time I had calculated they deserved to suffer before legal intervention took over permanently. As the final second ticked away, I slowly reached my right hand back into the deep inner pocket of my suit jacket. Pulling out the small black digital remote, I pressed the second blue button near the bottom edge. The magnetic security locks sealing the double doors disengaged with a loud, sharp electronic click. Before anyone in the panicked boardroom could react, the heavy wooden doors were thrust open with explosive force. A massive tactical team composed of heavily armed federal agents, U.S. Marshals, and local homicide detectives poured into the room. Moving with military precision, they raised their weapons and shouted deafening orders, taking complete control of the chaotic corporate space. Tactical boots thudded against the hardwood floor as armed agents quickly secured the perimeter. The sharp metal clinking of heavy steel handcuffs, locking tightly around wrists, echoed through the room, cutting through the heavy breathing and the sounds of shattered glass. The arrogant villains who had walked into this room expecting a glorious financial coronation were now being forced down against the mahogany table and glass walls. I stood tall at the front of the room, calmly watching the total collapse of my enemies unfold with mechanical precision. Stephanie was the first to completely break down under the overwhelming pressure of the raid. The elegant daughter-in-law I had once warmly welcomed into my home and gifted a luxury condo was now sobbing uncontrollably in the corner. Her expensive silk dress was torn, her hair ruined. She tried desperately to negotiate with the cold federal investigator, pulling her arms behind her back. "Please, you have to listen to me," she wailed, her voice cracking with pathetic desperation. "I can tell you absolute everything about the hidden offshore bank accounts. I'll give you all the encrypted passwords." Tears streamed down her pale face as she continued to beg. "Just give me a generous plea deal, and I'll testify against all of them in court." I was just following orders. The federal agent ignored her desperate bargaining, tightening the cold steel cuffs and forcing her to her feet. I felt zero sympathy for her. This was the exact same woman who, just days ago, had smiled sweetly at my bedside while trying to feed me a synthetic substance meant to trigger a fatal cardiac arrest. As Stephanie tried to trade loyalty for a reduced sentence, Cynthia realized her 35-year deception had reached its absolute end. The perfect mask she had worn for 4 decades shattered completely. She managed to break free from the arresting officer for a brief second, throwing her body across the ruined carpet. Dropping to her knees at my feet, her trembling hands grabbed frantically at the fabric of my suit trousers. Her pale face twisted into a mask of pure terror and agony. "Harrison, please!" she sobbed hysterically, her voice bouncing off the high glass windows. "You have to stop them. Please tell them this is all a terrible mistake." I looked down at the woman I had once loved unconditionally and trusted blindly with my life. She looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes, trying to use the same artificial affection that had blinded me to her toxic betrayal for nearly 40 years. "This was all Vincent's terrible idea," she sobbed, her trembling finger pointing across the room. "He manipulated me, Harrison. He forced me to go along with the plan to take your company. I never truly wanted you gone. I love you, Harrison. I've always loved you." Her desperate, pathetic lies hung heavy in the cold air between us. I stood there looking down at her weeping form, feeling absolutely no remaining affection, grief, or mercy. The overwhelming emotional pain I had suffered in the isolation of my private study had been completely replaced by ice-cold, rock-solid resolve. I looked straight into her tear-filled eyes. "You don't even know the true meaning of that word," I said softly, my deep voice remaining steady and devoid of emotion. I smoothly pulled my leg back, forcing her desperate grip off my trousers. Taking a slow step back, I put physical distance between myself and the toxic parasite I had mistakenly called my beloved wife. "You sold your soul, your family, and your honor for money," I said coldly. "Now you have to pay the ultimate price. Enjoy your long time in federal prison." Two strong federal marshals stepped forward, grabbing Cynthia's shoulders and pulling her away from my feet. She screamed, struggling wildly in their firm grip, but they locked heavy cuffs onto her wrists, ignoring her loud protests. Across the ruined boardroom, local homicide detectives were dealing with the aftermath of the brutal struggle between father and son. Bradley was yanked up from the carpet. His expensive suit was in tatters, and blood dripped from an ugly cut above his right eye. His face was heavily bruised and swelling rapidly from his biological father's furious assault. Bradley stumbled on his feet, looking completely disoriented and terrified as the cold metal locked around his wrists. The arrogant corporate executive, who had confidently handed me a gold pen to sign away my empire, was now a broken, bleeding suspect. He looked desperately around the chaotic room for any form of salvation. But he didn't look at me, the man who had funded his 35 years of lavish privilege. Instead, he looked directly at the wealthy billionaire rival leaning against the far wall in handcuffs. "Dad, please," Bradley cried out, his voice cracking with panic. "You have to help me. You have to use your lawyers to fix this." Vincent Cross turned his head, glaring at his biological son with pure hatred. The grieving father, who had just discovered his own flesh and blood, had taken the life of his youngest son, offered no comfort. "You are completely dead to me," Vincent growled, spitting the bitter words across the room. Vincent was pushed forward by federal agents, completely ignoring his bleeding son, who had betrayed him for a mere $3 million. I stood quietly in the center of the large room, calmly watching as the armed officers systematically led all 4 suspects toward the wide-open double doors. The 50 senior members of my board crowded near the back wall, watching this shocking spectacle in stunned silence. They had just witnessed a massive criminal conspiracy dismantled with undeniable proof. I watched closely as federal agents escorted them into the waiting elevator. A 35-year counterfeit family was cleanly severed. Stephanie was still weeping loudly, her head hung in absolute shame. Next, they pushed Vincent inside, his face a mask of rage and defeat. Bradley followed, stumbling weakly as blood dripped onto his ruined white shirt. Finally, they dragged Cynthia into the heavy metal box. She looked back at me one last time, silently begging for a rescue that would never come. I stood my ground, unmoving. 6 months have passed since the heavy magnetic doors of my corporate boardroom unlocked to reveal that tactical team. The harsh winter that had frozen the city of Chicago has completely melted away, leaving the busy streets bathed in the warm, bright, healing sunlight of a new summer. The natural transition of the seasons perfectly mirrors the profound transformation in my own life. In those first painful weeks following the raid, I worked closely with federal authorities, local homicide detectives, and my sharp corporate attorney, Jonathan Reed. We had to meticulously ensure every loose end of their criminal conspiracy was permanently tied down. The extensive legal proceedings following the arrests were swift, brutal, and utterly relentless. The justice system moved with terrifying efficiency, leaving my former fake family no room to manipulate the truth. The fraudulent death certificate they had proudly displayed was officially annulled, and the $20 million they had illegally extracted from my offshore accounts was fully recovered by federal agents within 48 hours. Every asset, bank account, and digital footprint was thoroughly audited and frozen by the government. Vincent Cross, the arrogant, cold billionaire who had spent his adult life destroying rival companies, was completely erased from the global business world. When news of his direct involvement in the conspiracy went public, his massive logistics empire collapsed almost overnight. The federal government seized his corporate assets, froze his offshore accounts, and dissolved his entire executive board. During the high-profile trial, he appeared as a hollow, broken shadow of his former self. The crushing reality that his biological son had ended the life of his youngest child completely shattered his mind. He didn't even attempt to mount a strong legal defense against the overwhelming charges. He sat quietly in the crowded federal courtroom, staring blankly at the solid wooden table. As the judge sentenced him to spend the remainder of his life behind the cold steel bars of a maximum security federal prison, he will pass away alone in a concrete cell, completely stripped of his fortune, fake dignity, and power. The corporate monster who had stopped at nothing to take my life was entirely consumed by his own blind greed. Bradley met an equally devastating and permanent fate. The spoiled, arrogant young man I had lovingly raised, generously funded, and blindly trusted for 35 years faced the absolute highest legal consequences for his ultimate betrayal. His expensive defense attorneys tried desperately to argue that he had been heavily manipulated by his mother and biological father, but the physical evidence presented in court was utterly irrefutable. I sat in the gallery and watched as federal prosecutors held up a torn, expensive dress shirt permanently stained with red clay and diesel fuel from my unmapped quarry. The exact same shirt I had watched him frantically scrub in a basement sink at midnight. The high-definition audio recordings captured from my private study, along with the recovery of the victim's body wrapped in heavy canvas, sealed his fate. He was officially convicted of first-degree murder, attempted murder, and massive corporate financial conspiracy. When the heavy legal sentence of consecutive life terms, without the possibility of parole, was officially delivered, he collapsed in the silent courtroom. He wept openly, like a terrified child, calling out desperately to me, begging the old man he thought he had outsmarted to magically save him from this harsh reality. I sat unmoving, looking at his bruised face with absolute indifference. I felt not a single drop of mercy for the parasite who had actively planned to stop my heart with poison just to steal my life's work. Dragged away in heavy metal chains, the convicted killer will spend the next 50 years in a small, dark cell, constantly looking over his shoulder in absolute fear. Stephanie, the elegant daughter-in-law who had so sweetly served me hot chamomile tea, laced with a lethal, synthetic compound, learned a harsh lesson about loyalty and betrayal. Her frantic attempt to offer testimony against her husband and mother-in-law in a desperate bid for a generous plea deal failed completely. Ambitious federal prosecutors had no need for her unreliable testimony. My tactical team had already provided them with flawless, military-grade surveillance footage documenting her active role in the crime right in my master bedroom. With no valuable leverage left to trade for her freedom, she was forced to face the full weight of the justice system. She was officially sentenced to serve 2 consecutive life terms for her direct involvement in the attempted assassination and financial conspiracy. The luxury condo I had generously bought her as a wedding gift was immediately seized by the government to help pay for massive financial restitution. She will spend the best remaining decades of her young life in a cheap jumpsuit, completely stripped of her silk gowns, imported makeup, and fake smile. She foolishly traded a life of infinite luxury for a cold concrete cell. But the most profound poetic justice was reserved for Cynthia. My wife of 40 years, the woman who had comfortably shared my bed while secretly plotting my violent end, met a fate far worse than a standard prison sentence. She narrowly avoided a direct attempted murder conviction because her attorneys successfully argued she wasn't physically present at the quarry during the midnight disposal, nor had she directly handed me the toxic blue pills. However, she was completely ruined by the financial and civil courts. My loyal attorney, Jonathan Reed, flawlessly executed a series of complex infidelity and fraud clauses deeply buried in our original estate documents. Because of her long-term infidelity and active conspiracy to commit corporate theft, she was legally stripped of every single physical and financial asset she possessed. The vast funds she thought she had successfully transferred to offshore accounts were instantly frozen, recovered, and returned directly to my primary holdings. She was left completely penniless, without a single dollar to her name. She couldn't afford a luxury apartment or even a modest rental in the worst part of town. Today, she resides in an underfunded state facility in a noisy, run-down suburb of the city. She shares a tiny, crowded room with a stranger, eats bland institutional food, and wears cheap, donated clothes. She receives 0 visitors, as her entire wealthy social circle abandoned her the second her shocking crimes became public knowledge. She is forced to wake up early every morning, vividly remembering the beautiful estate, imported sports cars, and infinite financial freedom she selfishly threw away for nothing. As for me, I refuse to let this terrible betrayal turn me into a bitter, isolated old man. I actively use the pain to burn away the dead, toxic wood from my life and plant healthy new seeds. Over the past 6 months, I completely restructured the executive leadership of my global logistics empire. I systematically removed every single director and manager who had displayed even the slightest hint of questionable loyalty during the crisis. I quickly replaced them with talented young professionals who deeply value hard work and honesty over toxic office politics. I personally oversaw the process of clearing all unauthorized tracking malware Stephanie had secretly installed on my home network, ensuring my privacy was restored. I sold the large, empty Chicago estate, where all those awful lies had been spun, and purchased a sleek, ultra-modern penthouse in the heart of the city, a place perfectly suited for my new minimalist lifestyle. At the very top of this new corporate hierarchy, he sits the one person who truly earned my absolute, unconditional trust. My incredibly sharp, loyal, and decisive daughter, Natalie. When my life was in danger, she proved her immense worth not through empty words or fake affection, but through decisive, calculated action. She did whatever was necessary to protect her father and the empire we built. Today is Friday, exactly 6 months since that chaotic morning in the locked boardroom. The late afternoon sun shines brightly over the city of Chicago, casting a warm golden glow over the towering glass skyscrapers of the financial district. I stand proudly on the open-air private rooftop terrace of my corporate headquarters. A cool summer breeze brushes against my face, carrying the faint, energetic hum of the bustling city far below. I look out over the vast skyline, feeling a deep, undeniable peace I haven't experienced in over 40 years. I am no longer weighed down by the suffocating burden of a fake family. I am no longer draining my energy to provide endless luxury to ungrateful parasites who secretly wished for my demise. I am completely on my own now, but I am by no means lonely. The memories of toxic tea, fake tears, and secret burner phone calls have slowly faded, replaced by the solid reality of my peaceful new life. Natalie steps quietly onto the rooftop terrace, wearing a sharp suit that perfectly matches her commanding professional presence. She stands right beside me, resting her hands gently on the smooth glass railing. Together, we look out at the gleaming city, sharing a comfortable, silent understanding that requires no words. I reach into the inner pocket of my suit jacket and carefully pull out a small velvet box. Opening it, I reveal the heavy, gold-plated pen resting inside. It's the exact same pen Bradley had eagerly handed me in that dark room when he tried to force me into signing away my life's work. I gently lift the gold pen from the soft black velvet and hand it directly to my loyal daughter. She takes it with a firm, steady grip, looking at me with deep, unspoken respect. On a small glass table, right behind us, lies a stack of official corporate transition documents. But these aren't fraudulent papers designed to steal my fortune. This is a legitimate, fully authorized CEO contract, transferring absolute power to its rightful heir. Natalie walks confidently to the table, leans forward, and uses the heavy gold pen to fluently sign her name on the dotted line. I watch her sign the final legal document, feeling an overwhelming wave of genuine fatherly pride rise in my chest. At 70 years old, I am not standing at the bitter end of my life. I am standing proudly at the bright, exciting beginning of a beautiful new chapter. I have successfully passed the torch of corporate leadership to an extraordinary woman who will undoubtedly lead this company to incredible new heights. I am finally free to travel the world, to read, to breathe, and to simply live without constantly looking over my shoulder for a knife in my back. I survived the ultimate betrayal, and I emerged stronger, sharper, and completely liberated. Through this painful journey, the most important lesson I learned is that blood is merely biology. True loyalty is an active, deliberate choice. Real wealth isn't measured by the millions in your bank account, but by the authenticity of the people sitting at your table. For decades, I let the illusion of a perfect family blind me to the parasites draining my life's work. Trust is a beautiful thing, but blind trust is a death sentence. When you detect deception, don't fight it with emotion. Fight it with cold, hard evidence. Never be afraid to cut toxic people loose, even if they sleep under your roof. Sometimes you have to burn down the entire forest, just to let healthy trees grow. If this story opened your eyes, please like and subscribe. Have you ever uncovered a shocking betrayal from someone you completely trusted? Leave your experiences in the comments below. Let me know where you're watching from. And stay tuned for the next story of survival and truth.